Attackers no longer steal data. They are positioning to turn it into, I'm going to turn the lights off for an entire city. I'm going to stop the fuel flow, or I'm going to shut off water supply for an entire district. That's the scale that we are looking at. Every day that the pipeline was shut down, it was estimated that it was costing them $420 million per day. If there is a war in the future, they are prepared to disrupt these critical sources of infrastructure for the entire nation. Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Great Cyber Podcast. My name is Aniket and I have with me Dr. Byrd. We are the hosts for this podcast and we welcome you to yet another episode. And this time we talk about something really unique. Dr. Byrd, welcome to another episode. What are you thinking today?
Hello, everyone. Hey, Aniket. It's always a pleasure to get together and talk about things that are important to technology, the infrastructure. Today, we're going to have a conversation about the infrastructure, the critical infrastructure. One thing that's really unique about that, Aniket, is that it consists of both the physical and virtual systems, right? And when we think about the critical infrastructure, this refers to assets and systems, networks, people, right? And both physical and virtual. And it's the very foundation of our society and economy.
So true. So true. And these different sectors or these critical sectors of infrastructure, while it might sound or look small on a piece of paper, but if you go and visit a nuclear power plant, you will see the massive size at which it operates. Its supply chain has a supply chain, and it's a huge thing to implement. And the bigger the target, the bigger the risk. That's the mantra that we have been following.
Exactly. That's really what's unique about the sector. And we saw this kind of transition in the Presidential Policy Directive 21. There was a organizational kind of framework around what we call the 16 critical sectors. That includes communications, energy, food and agriculture, healthcare, financial, defense, industrial base, just to name a few, the 16 sectors, right?
Right.
And what's unique is that it consists of public ownership and some private, government ownership. And where we saw the kind of disparity in technical know-how and capability, cyber criminals and nation states got a chance to exploit that. And this is a moving target as far as resilience, right? Because it is so critical globally, as you articulated, to how societies work and function.
Yep. And attackers no longer steal data. They are positioning to turn it into, I'm going to turn the lights off for an entire city. I'm going to stop the fuel flow, or I'm going to shut off water supply for an entire district. That's the scale that we are looking at.
Exactly. And to your point, it's about strategic and global positioning. It's about economic advantage. It's about cyber strategy in a nutshell. Some of the things that we have seen in the threat landscape, of course, is the Colonial Pipeline. You and I were just talking about that.
That is so true. And Colonial Pipeline as a case study, I think is really unique because I love a quote. The quote is, "Those who don't study history are condemned to repeat it."
Great point.
And that's why we need to understand and dig through what has happened in the past to understand how we can protect ourselves in the future. Now, Dr. Byrd, you mentioned about the threat adversaries. So when it comes to the threat adversaries, I think there are three different sections of these adversities, or three different forces that are really defining how the attacks are happening. The first being the nation-state prepositioning. This is where the Chinese state groups like the Volt Typhoon and the Salt Typhoon have hacked into the US infrastructure like telecommunications, energy, and water, but not to spy, but more from a readiness point of view. If there is a war in the future, they are prepared to disrupt these critical sources of infrastructure for the entire nation.
Exactly. And a second component of that is just that the malware that we see being implemented in the systems as form
Yeah.
of ransomware, right? When we think
Right.
about it, it's the ability to execute malicious software within an organization that disrupts functions and operations that you would normally expect. Think about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our
Yeah.
systems and resources, right? So when you
Yeah.
overlay that to something that is part of the critical infrastructure, whether it's Colonial Pipeline, the ability to pump gas and fuel from point A to
Yeah.
point B when it's needed, that
Yeah.
is, disastrous. And
Very true.
ransomware, again, the cyber criminals have the ability to control those systems and resources, takes
Yeah.
away from the system owners, and they have the ability to control that for strategic advantage. Whether that's, hey, pay the ransom, right? It also
Right.
provides them with the ability to exfiltrate data while all of this is going on. And even once ransom is paid, you don't
Hmm.
know that, they're going to honor that code. They have still
So,
stolen and exfiltrated data that they can
yeah.
later subsequently ransom again, right?
Right.
So you want to take these proactive steps that you and I always talk about to stay resilient, right? That's the
So true.
importance here.
So true. Every company has to play the what if game. What if this happens in the future? What's going to be my response to that? Because it is the response of a company that defines its future, not the reaction that it gives. Talking about reactions, the IT and the OT, that is operational technology, has also been a huge target for these attackers and adversaries because they know that this is decades old industry equipment. When it was created, it was not created with cybersecurity in mind. And that's why the attackers go after that. And this kind of OT is, they are the building blocks of the critical infrastructure, right?
Exactly. It's really the Internet of Things, the actuators, the PLCs, the SCADA systems that when
Yeah,
they are implemented right in the manufacturing or production process for industrial equipment, it's there for the life cycle, 10 or 15-year life cycle, right? So it may have some
yeah,
initial firmware or operating system, but it was not designed with the forethought of, hey, this is the evolving and threat landscape. Some of that is starting to change and evolve now. And you
yeah,
see the government putting things in place to support, again, this private ownership of these resources to support
yeah,
them, right? This technology and cyber gap that we're
right.
seeing. And we see that with tabletop exercises. CISA and DHS has put out, quite a bit of information to support
Yes,
the maturing of the critical infrastructure.
that's right. Now, Dr. Bird, you spend a lot of time discussing these things with the government agencies. What has been your experience on working with them? Did you get to work on any of these attacks or formulating a strategy to prevent a future one?
Yep. Thanks, Aniket. That's really a great point. Again, after the presidential directive came out, you saw organizations like the NIST and DHS and CISA trying to
Yeah,
come up with standards, right? So these standards aren't necessarily laws per se, but they're
hmm,
critical frameworks. And
right.
again, the NIST does a great job compiling organizations globally, academia, the public and private sector to
Yes,
develop what best practices look like specifically for that threat landscape. You know what I mean?
right,
So
right.
we get a chance to see, to your point earlier when we started the conversation, of the critical infrastructure, the supply chain risk. And
Hmm.
out of that, we talked about the importance of multi-factor authentication, right?
Yep.
The importance of changing username and passwords from defaults that are shipped with the equipment, right? Having the ability to maintenance and service the equipment. And even lately in the AI generated space now, we see
Hmm.
CISA developing these standards and processes around prioritizing and mitigating cyber vulnerabilities, right?
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
are present in the critical infrastructure. Just a couple weeks ago,
Hmm.
there was something called the Binding Operational Directive, trying to shorten the attack surface, right? Making
Okay.
sure that we're taking the appropriate steps to mitigate high risk vulnerabilities, right? And we're talking about things that are inside the critical infrastructure.
Right, right. And these directives from CISA, they are really becoming the point or towards the right direction, where the leaders from the critical infrastructure will take all the efforts, get the budgets, and start moving in the right direction.
Exactly, exactly. And
Yeah,
it really takes a community effort. Like we said,
right.
we're talking about the scope and scale. For example, if you're talking about hospitals or oil and gas or water, you're talking about not only big cities, but rural communities, right? That
Yes,
rely on
yes.
the information that's ebbing and flowing throughout the ecosystem. So anytime there is a hitch, right? A link, a weak link, that is compromised by cyber criminals or by nation states, there is an issue.
Hmm.
So we're
Yeah,
talking about, again, the importance of asset management,
yeah,
hardware and software,
right.
understanding, right, what these systems look like, our public networks, our private networks, making sure we have the appropriate controls in place and having a strategy to do so. And that takes
Hmm.
practice, right? That takes tabletops and working through and understanding and building a level of muscle memory around the know-how and the best practices that we talk about. And then this is a great place to start that.
Yeah, so true. Now, when we see any large list of entities, there is always an urge to prioritize. That's where what we see is there are four sectors which are considered as the most foundational because almost every other sector depends on them. And that's the energy, communications, water, and transportation. Now, these are the sectors which really define the strategy for the rest of them as well because of the interdependency that they have. Now, with AI coming in and the threat actors are really getting to accelerate their attack cycles, they have access to many more payloads and exploits than what they had earlier. So, how do you think the world has changed now in the AI era?
Again, we're talking about the importance of asset management and really understanding what's in our ecosystem and environment, and then
Yeah,
putting a framework around how do we make sure that the life cycle is cared for, right? The technology
right.
life cycle. We also call this governance, but it's really the common sense. It's not only the purchasing, the acquisition of technology and putting it in our ecosystem,
Yeah,
understanding what those vendors, right, are doing to harden and protect their technology when it's entering commerce. Once we implement the technology within our organization, the water, the communication, the transportation, just like you articulated, making sure that there's a plan to care and maintenance for that, right? That includes
yeah,
vulnerability management and things of that nature, right? And
that's true.
table topping and making sure that we have a plan in place to implement if needed or as needed.
That's true. That's true. And tabletops are very interesting, especially when they are being done in a simulated environment. When there's a live attack going on, then it is not really interesting. Then it's all giving everyone a lot of tension and stress. But now coming to a simulated environment, my experience with tabletops is where in one of the previous companies where I was leading cybersecurity, we had a tabletop which went on for 16 hours
Yes.
where different teams just walked in and then they walked past because their task was done. We had legal teams coming in, we had incident response, we had somebody from the cybersecurity team, and the person who is controlling the or they are managing or they are facilitating the tabletop exercise. They will keep feeding you new information. Like, okay, right now 20 users are not able to open anything on the email. Their laptops are not working, and with this situation, you start working. So it's really about mapping these tabletop exercises. They need to evolve as per the real life incidents that are happening. The tabletops should evolve. So we are really able to simulate that doomsday environment within the confined gaps of four walls and have everyone having a mental exercise, a mental gym, or what's the military term for training, Dr. Bird, where everyone goes through a lot of those challenges.
It may be some boot camps or foundational training. That's
Yes.
important. Another thing that comes to mind when you talk about tabletops and the importance of that is like fire drills, right? I remember as a
Yes.
kid, in elementary school, you would have these fire drills throughout the year, and you would
Yeah.
find your rallying point. There would be someone who would take control and make sure certain classrooms used one entrance and not another, right? So if
Yeah.
something should happen, you knew how to exit the building safely, where to rally, who was
Yeah.
calling the fire department, who was calling the first responders, all of those
Yeah.
type of things. And the
So true.
important thing was, not necessarily to, get it right. You knew there were going to be hiccups, but that you
Hmm.
have some level of muscle memory and some idea and some notional framework of how do you exit, where are the exits so you don't panic, and where is our
Yeah.
rallying point? Who's calling the appropriate authorities? Who's doing
So
the head
true.
counts? All of those things that you just don't want to be in the middle of, something going wrong and saying, hey, do we have all the individuals out of the building? Are we at the rallying point? So you set those roles and responsibilities like you articulated. People are coming and going inside the workspace, whether you're doing a cyber tabletop. The moderator
Yes.
is introducing new linchpins, so to speak, new
Yeah. Yeah.
things that have come up to
Yeah.
determine, hey, how do we address that? How do we share communications within the organization? How do we update the different stakeholders? Who's calling
Hmm.
what? Who's responsible for calling the different organizations, keeping different leadership chains up to date
Yeah.
as to what's
Yeah.
happening. So again, if you hadn't thought about that, you develop this playbook and say, okay, Aniket, you're responsible for these two or three things. I'm responsible for
Yes.
two or three things, and so forth. And then if there are issues that need to be addressed, then you determine, hey, do we need to hire more staff? How do we, address these things accordingly? So these are great exercises, again, reminiscent of some of those initial on-school childhood memories I had of the fire drill, so to speak, and the
Yeah.
preparation that went in there, therein to protect the school.
So true. So true. And in these virtual fire drills, when there's a fire of ransomware, one of the first assets that one needs to really protect is the backups, because the attackers are going to go after the backups, delete them, trying to ensure that you don't have a way back. Now, talking about these ransomware, I think we can talk about the Colonial Pipeline for the next few minutes. And as we are wrapping up today's episode, we can talk about the incident where 75 bitcoins were paid as a ransom. At that time, it amounted to 4.4 million USD. Interestingly, Department of Justice recovered 2.3 million USD from this amount later on. But then again, when some an event like this happens, that creates those positive ripple effects as well, and that helps everyone to understand the importance of the critical infrastructure security, right?
Exactly. Out of the Colonial Pipeline discussion, as people unpack case studies, there were questions
Yeah,
about like our previous topic, insurance.
yeah,
Do
yeah,
we have insurance? Should organizations buy insurance? What is covered? What is enough
yeah.
insurance? Do we have
That's
an
true.
incident management firm? How do we even get bitcoins? Who knows how to find that stuff? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
again, you have these critical conversations through the analysis of case studies. That's why in all of our courses and podcasts and things like that, we use them. And we
yeah.
use them not to just highlight, oh no, what happened, but we use them as learning points, right? To say,
Right.
what happened here? How did this transpire? How do
Yeah.
you get, who manages communicating back and forth with the threat actors, all of those type of things. And if your
So true.
organization says, hey, we need help with that, then, there may be third party companies that you may seek to, consult law firms that can help with that. So that's when you kind of go through those exercises through the tabletops to figure out where the gaps and the opportunities are to improve. And this is constantly evolving as your technology and as your
Yeah.
ecosystem evolves. That's constantly evolving.
Authority plays an important part as well. Generally, if you wanted to reboot or shut down any of the IT infra, it will take you weeks and weeks of process and approvals. But during a critical incident, the CISO or the security officer needs to have the authority to say that, okay, we have been, to take the example of the Colonial Pipeline, out of that entire private organization, only the IT or the billing section was impacted by the ransomware. But just out of caution, the organization decided to shut down most of their systems and their OT operations, all because of a preemptive move.
Exactly.
That's truly where somebody had the authority to make that call and execute it before the fire spreads everywhere.
And just think about it, Aniket. You don't know what you don't know. So as things
Yeah,
start to unfold, people are asking questions, what's happening, what
yeah,
else could be impacted? And, the organization just did not know. So they said, hey, let's take this offline until we can, assess and ensure that
yeah,
we have our handle on what's happening in our ecosystem. Again,
yeah.
when there's a incident, when there's an event, you just
Right.
don't know what's out there, and you're getting a lot of misinformation and all of that. So that led to, some of those decisions as well.
Very true. Very true. Every day that the pipeline was shut down, it was estimated that it was costing them $420 million per day.
Yes.
Later on, it was identified it wasn't that much, it was much lesser than that. But during that crisis moment, one has to take the call that if it's 420 million per day, how many days can we shut down the pipeline? And then in that, let's say 10 days timeline, you need to figure out the entire mess. Where did the attackers come from? Are we okay to restart the operations? Right?
Exactly, exactly. And just put yourself in the mindset of the IT professionals at Colonial Pipeline. You
Yeah.
know that you're part of the critical infrastructure. You know that you're part of the East Coast fuel supply, and you're feeding different, intermediaries. You don't know
Yeah.
if their system is compromised, your system is compromised completely, to what extent. So there's a
Yes.
lot of unknowns, right? So
That is
you're
true.
trying to take the best approach, right?
Right.
Organizing the information you have in front of you to make the best decision possible. So again, having playbooks in place and having points of contact within your organization and other stakeholders within the supply chain is important.
Yeah.
So you know who to reach out. Hey, Aniket, is your company impacted as well? No, we don't
Yeah.
have any. Our systems are all green, or we're go.
Yeah.
That gives you a level of assurance that, hey, you know, it may be contained to one environment or one organization. While these things are happening, you just don't know.
So true. There is one more point that I want to bring out, and this point impacts most of the leadership team at any cybersecurity organization, and that's about the mental health and the mental stability of the person who's taking all these decisions. I have many friends who are CISOs. During a critical incident, one of the main things that a leader has to do is to keep their mind calm while everyone else is losing theirs. And it
Yes.
reminds me of that poem from If by Rudyard Kipling. I would urge our readers and our listeners to go ahead and check this poem called If. But in that it says you need to keep your mind while everybody else is losing theirs, and that's truly where what you mentioned earlier, Dr. Bird, the plans that you have practiced all of these months, those plans become your single source of truth when there's fire everywhere, right?
Exactly, exactly, and that's a great analogy. Again, with the elementary school fire drills or the tabletop
Yes,
exercises, you know that you won't execute them perfectly, but you have a
yes,
notional idea of how things should go. And as a
that's right.
leader, you know who to call. That gives you a level of assurance that, hey, I'm in this organization. I understand that I'm part of this bigger ecosystem, the critical infrastructure. If I
Yeah,
need to reach out to my suppliers, people
right.
that are depending on our company, I have a point of contact. I know I can call, Aniket in this company, Justice in
Yeah,
that company, and they
yes,
can, at least give me the thumbs up or thumbs down. and then we know how to escalate accordingly. So again, those playbooks are so helpful. Having the organizational structure within your ecosystem, from legal to IT, the CIO, the CISO,
Reporting.
the reporting, all of that,
Yes.
is critical to be resilient in today's threat landscape.
That's true. That's true. In fact, one thing that I would like to urge our listeners to experiment with is run your own tabletop exercise with an AI. Maybe go to ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT that, hey, I want to run a tabletop exercise with you on a personal level. That, let's say, somebody hacked into my bank account and I can see that transactions are happening. Go. And from there, you can assess your personal readiness for a personal level catastrophe from a cyber risk perspective.
That's a great point. That's something that you can part of your family resilience, right? Tabletopping, who to call, make sure you're definitely, your family is operating and have access to systems and resources. You may have kids off to college. You may support your family, your parents, and things like that, making sure they have what they need and things like that. So that's a great way to think about tabletopping, cyber hygiene, cyber resilience, and practicing that in your own family. Great point, Aniket.
So true. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Byrd. All right. So with this, we wrap up this episode. Any last comments before we wrap up this episode, Dr. Byrd?
No, I think we covered everything. We covered the importance of the critical infrastructure. We provided the foundational notion that it's the very backbone of our societies and our economies. The 16 sectors are the oil and gas, the banking and finance, the communication, emergency, right? And this happens at a community level and at a global level. And cyber hygiene, those very foundational components that we talk about of confidentiality, integrity, and availability are the backbone of what we're trying to provide, right? And we do that through resilience and those best practices that we promote and practice.
That's true. If somebody were to take a blood sample of a cybersecurity professional and analyze the DNA, they're going to find a lot of triangles over there.
I think so. I think
That's
so.
what I feel.
A lot of triangles, a lot of stress, cholesterol, worry, and all of those type of things. High blood pressure, all of those things too, right?
All those things too. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Byrd. And all the listeners, I hope you liked this episode. We are going to come back with the next one with an even more interesting topic. What are you feeling about this episode so far? Do let us know. We want to hear you in the comment section. So this is Dr. Byrd and Aniket signing off from yet another episode of the Great Cyber Podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
See you next time. Bye.